We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
James Madison once wrote, "The advancement of science and the diffusion of information is the best element to true liberty." But what happens when the government and the press collude to craft narrative and rewrite the very basics of our human story? I'd like to welcome you to Liberty Nation Radio, here on the Radio America, heard coast to coast. I'm your host, Mark Angelides. On today's show, we're going to examine the media cartel operation. We're going to look at how governments pick winners and losers in a supposed free market. And we're going to ask whether missing senators are a problem that even really needs to be solved. Now, I'd also like to say a special thank you and hello to our listeners out on KNTR 106.3 FM on Lake City, Havasu, Arizona. We appreciate you. Remember, this show is proudly sponsored by LibertyNation.com, where you can access podcasts, breaking news, analysis, and a range of biting and brilliant shows to whet your appetite for freedom and your fondness for the great American Constitution. Let's jump right in. In recent weeks, we've witnessed a bevy of media outlets push back against Elon Musk's Twitter platform for designating them as state-sponsored or government-funded. But does the Fourth Estate perhaps protest too much? Well, we're joined by author Joe Shafer, who's been covering the ebb and flow of the interactions on the pages of Liberty Nation, and he's going to guide us through this particular morass. Thanks for being here, Joe. Much appreciated.
Thanks for having me.
So let's start with who got labeled, what and why they think such designations are unfair.
Well, NPR was the big one. They were labeled originally state-affiliated media, which caused a big conniption on their part. And I just thought that Musk handled it perfectly. When PBS joined them, they're not exactly the same entity, although they're both funded by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting in different ways. But I thought Musk handled it perfectly. He said, PBS, in a rage fit, quit Twitter, along with NPR. It was state-funded PBS quits Twitter to rage after being labeled state-funded, you know? So it's just, he's poking these media outlets at their most sensitive spot, which is their thin skin. They can't handle this kind of criticism. They want to be considered the pure journalists, even though, you know, it is a completely accurate description. They receive government funding and they cover the government. They are state-affiliated media.
So isn't the separation of point of views here that it's publicly funded rather than state funded? And is that a distinction without a difference?
Well, in the article that I brought up, and this is what I think is just perfect, is that NPR and PBS, they can't even report honestly about themselves. So every time they write about this, they say we get less than 1% of our funding from the government. Well, it's not true. And I found a tweet by a former NPR CEO. Her name is Vivian Schiller. She's a very connected person. She's worked at different points for NBC, the New York Times. She's at the Aspen Institute now, very connected globalist elite. So she's very connected. And she explained the situation. She said, technically, NPR receives 1% of their funding directly from the government. However, and let me read the quote here because I got to make sure I get it right. NPR gets 1/3 of its funding from programming and membership fees from its hundreds of local member stations. And these stations collectively receive well over $100 million from the U.S. government. So, you know, they say, oh, it's only 1%. It's an insubstantial amount. Well over $100 million. They can't even honestly report about the money they're receiving from the federal government.
It seems almost like a big money shell game, Joe. I mean, there's actually something very similar in my home country with the British Broadcasting Corporation, the BBC, which I'm sure everybody's familiar with. They also got into a label spat with Elon Musk, especially after he well, let's be fair, he decimated one of their interviewers over his allegations of a hate speech rise on Twitter since his takeover. But now the BBC correctly pointed out that they are publicly funded. and that the only government money they get is, I think it's a mere 90 million pounds, which goes for the BBC World Service. So it's a very small part of their operating budget. However, what is never mentioned is that in the United Kingdom, if you want to own a television that is capable of picking up the BBC, you have to pay the BBC license fee, and that is enforced by the law and the government. Now, here's the thing. Even if you don't watch the BBC on your television, you still have to pay. Even if you can prove that you've never watched the BBC on your television, you still have to pay. And in fact, people end up in prison, and it's mostly housewives, to be honest. They end up in prison for, first, not paying a TV license. Then the people come round to the house, demand entry, sometimes with police in tow, saying that, we're here to check that your TV, and they come into the house, invasion of privacy, and then it just escalates to the point where if people don't pay the fines associated with not having a TV license, even if they've never watched the BBC, they can be sent to prison for non-payment of fines, and people do go to prison for it. Tell me that's not government funded.
That's insane. Yeah, that is exactly what NPR is doing in a different way, in that they're not honestly revealing that they are much more funded by the government than they let on. And I think a big part of it is they really want to hold on to this past legacy of them being widespread. I think they really believe in their own deluded minds that, oh yeah, there are these conservatives out there, these Trump supporters, whatever. They don't like our slanted coverage, but we're so gosh darn important that they're reading us anyway. And they really want to believe that. It's not true. They're easy to ignore. And the thing that really angers people the most is that they are forced to give their taxpayer money to something they're not even remotely interested in. And we won't even get into how deeply offensive a lot of their stuff is when they're writing articles, as I wrote an article about, I think last September, where NPR came out and said kindergartners needed to learn about sex education. Now, there are a lot of Americans who don't want their taxpayer dollars supporting this. And not only do they make the taxpayers support this in their deluded minds of saying, well, we're so important, they're reading us anyway. And it's just not true.
It's not. I mean, you do get the same thing from the big box media outlets as well. They seem to think that they're the outlet of record, when in fact, I think some of the more recent figures for CNN show that they have 400,000 viewers a day, which, I mean, that's what people in airports, right? That's it. They've only got the airports and maybe the people in DC. Now, let's get a little broader here, Joe. What do you think Elon Musk is trying to achieve by adding these labels? Although we should point out there's no outcry from the political left when Twitter labels places like Russia and China, and they get the same treatment. Isn't he just leveling the playing field, or is there something more at play?
I think he's deliberately poking them at their sensitive spot, which, like I said, is their thin skin and is also their credentialism. They really enjoyed the last 6+ years of being the outlet against disinformation. And Musk has totally turned the tables on them, saying, hey, if we're going to talk about disinformation, let's talk about your setup here. You're receiving money from people that you cover, and you're giving them favorable press attention, which is easy to verify how NPR and these other organizations, soft pedal their questions. NPR actually went to Biden's White House press secretary and said, please defend us on this. Tell people that we're important. And she did. I mean, this is where we're at right now. So, Musk is just, is setting them up, and they're really doing a lot of his work for him by doing that. They look ridiculous. They want to hold on to this credentialism. They want to be important, and at the same time they're canned, they're controlled. And I do think that Elon Musk is deliberately exposing this. He's been hard on the New York Times as I basically call them a propaganda outlet. So he has a bone to pick with what he considers regime media, and millions of Americans agree with him.
Yeah, I think it's something that pretty much every Twitter user understands. When they see a fiery post, it's bait. It's bait, and it's determined to catch you. And it seems that NPR, PBS, they failed to recognize it for what it is. Now, we'll be back with Joe tackling the growing distrust in the media after this short break. Don't go anywhere. We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides. Entertaining, informative, and just plain fun. Watch Liberty Nation's The Conservative Five. Produced by conservatives for conservatives. C5's The Left Free Zone. Hosted by Liberty Nation's Lisa K. Donner. Joined by a raucous, irreverent panel of authors. Deconstructing leftist narratives. Debating the hot topics. And remembering to laugh. Join the official conservative safe
You only
space.
did that to piss Jeff off.
Liberty Nation's The Conservative Five.